Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I am your host, Alan Moore, and today I'm excited to have Michael Kitces on the show to talk about the inaugural XYPN benchmarking survey. This year we hired the Ensemble practice to survey XYPN members to really understand their business. How are they growing, revenue year over year, and more. The report was pretty lengthy, so Michael and I talked through some of the highlights from the survey. There were a few things that surprised us and a few things that confirmed our original hypotheses. But overall, I think this data and the results will be extremely valuable to anyone looking to roll out a monthly retainer service model. Some of the highlights we focused on included how much revenue firms earn in their first several years in business, the number of clients advisors work with, the value of having a niche, the value of the CFP, how often advisors meet with clients, whether or not advisors are raising their fees, and more. If you're looking for more concrete data on how successful this business model can be, this is the episode for you. You can find any of the additional resources that we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/125. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN Radio listeners. It's the community of advisors we've all been looking for that's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. That's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here is my episode with Kitces. Hey, Michael, welcome back to the show, man.
It's good to be back. It's been a little while.
It has. You know, we used to do these once a month. Well, we would do sort of like the bonus mailbag episodes, and then I got behind, of course, because doing an extra episode every month got to be a bit much, but getting better. They need to.
Is it that burdensome to talk to me for an extra hour a month?
Every month?
Jeez.
Scheduling these things is tough, and scheduling you is tough. We're always here as we are tonight on a Friday night because we are super cool. Recording at 7:30 p.m. my time, 9:30 p.m. your time. So
yes, because what else is there to do on a Friday night but to talk about financial planning and the business of financial planning?
I know. I love it. People are like, the number one question people have asked me over the last 3.5 years is not, what's led to this success or where did you have the idea or what's been your greatest failure? It's, does Michael sleep? That's the number one question I get. When does Kitces sleep?
I really do. I don't have much social life outside of playing with my kids, but I really do sleep. Yeah.
My goal is just to be best friends with like people we work with, so I can be like, I have friends. I just work with my friends.
Yes,
I'm not expected to do evening activities.
That works for me.
Anyway, so today we wanted to sort of circle back on something that we launched or announced, I should say, at XYPN 17 2 months ago now, or by the time this is going live, even 3 months ago. So in August or late August in Dallas, but it was our benchmarking survey. And this is the first year that we have ever done a benchmarking survey, but we wanted to start to gather data because we get a lot of questions from members or I guess prospective members that will ask questions like, how much money will I spend in my first year? And we have this, we have a mock-up, sort of your first 12 months budget that shows exactly how much money you will spend, right? Because it's a projection. And what we know is it's wrong. It always is. It's just an estimate. And, we wanted to be able to say definitively, this is how much our advisors are actually spending in their first year. And this is how much they're actually making, because many times, and I'm guilty of it on the podcast sometimes, that, we bring on folks that say, oh, I made $100,000 in my first year. And people want to know, is that normal or is it not? And you and I are like, we want to know if that's normal. Is making $100,000 in your first year normal? Because we need to be sort of the services and what we offer as an organization will be different depending on how fast our firms are growing and the way that they're growing. And also, I feel like to validate some of the various tenets, if you will, that we're going to talk about around having a niche and whether or not the CFP is important. And again, just properly setting expectations, because I don't ever want anyone to feel like they were duped by us in giving unrealistic numbers to expect in their first year or two, because we know that success is largely dependent upon how much financial runway you have. So it was really exciting. And so I guess share with listeners sort of the group, because you found the group to actually do the benchmarking survey, because it sounds great to just like, well, let's gather some data, but it's a very intensive process to actually get this thing done.
It is. And my vision from the start was really to replicate what Moss Adams did years ago with the RIA benchmarking world. So for those who aren't familiar, Moss Adams was a consulting firm that was kind of the leading firm in practice management for financial advisors through much of the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. It was led by Mark Tibergien, who's now the CEO of Pershing Advisor Solutions. And they're basically the ones that put RIA benchmarking surveys, or really just financial advisor benchmarking surveys, on the map. No one had really done it rigorously before them. And they started doing it in the late 90s and straight through the 2000s. And so you go back to the early years of the study, and it was like the average RIA had $17 million and an assistant. And by 10 years later, the average RIA had $100 million and a staff of 5 to 7. And then by a decade after that, the average RIA had $185 million and a staff of 10 to 12. And they basically, in doing these annual benchmarking studies, didn't just provide very helpful benchmarking and practice management advice, but actually documented the growth and the evolution of the RIA model. And so lots of things that we talk about now of the standards of RIAs, and like where they hit challenge points and where they tend to grow and how profitable they should expect to be, and how much they typically pay to staff, and even labels like ensemble firms. All of that came from the Moss Adams benchmarking studies over the time that they were doing it. Now, that Moss Adams consulting group, you kind of split apart in the late 2000s. Mark Tibergien was hired away to become the CEO of Pershing Advisor Solutions, and the consultants that he had trained and developed when he was there, many of them ultimately moved on after Mark left, and created most of the advisor benchmarking and practice management studies that are out there today. So folks like Dan and Veen at FA Insight and Philip Palaviv at the Ensemble Practice were all part of this original Moss Adams consulting group. And so we actually went and hired Philip Palaviv of the Ensemble Practice to do the benchmarking study for XY Planning Network. Philip was one of the early people that drove the benchmarking studies. He was the guy who actually originated the label Ensemble Practice for RIAs. We actually had him recently on the Financial Advisor Success podcast. He was episode 40, just talking about the evolution of it, which was kind of amusing. He called them ensemble firms because he originally was going to call them multi-advisor professional firms, but he was doing this benchmarking study work like 15 to 20 years ago. So everything was in Excel on very small computer screens. And so multi-advisor professional didn't fit in the Excel column. So he was trying to come up with a shorter word that conveyed the point. And that's where ensemble came from.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, like the whole phenomenon was because small screens with Excel columns required shorter words. Brevity is the soul. So we actually hired Philip and his team at the Ensemble Practice to do what I very much view as kind of the first annual benchmarking study for XY Planning Network. And that, as we're really seeing the birth of this new model for serving clients as a financial advisor, where we want to really document not just what can we learn today about best practices and also, as you noted, realistic expectations about how firms seem to be growing and evolving over time. But we really want to be able to document over time how the business model grows and evolves as firms grow. I mean, again, like if you go back to the early days of the Moss Adams benchmarking studies, like the leading firms had $15 to $20 million under management. 20 years later, the leading firms have $10 billion under management, $20 billion under management. Like the from humble beginnings grew extraordinary things. And so, our goal with this is to track the same progression over time, see what we can learn about what's working today, and kind of bear witness to how this grows and evolves over time.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get better. Listeners have heard me try to articulate some of this in recent episodes, but I'm trying to get better about defining the real core difference. And it's not that we're doing financial planning, right? Like that's that's been done, that we didn't invent that. It's not even necessarily that we charge a monthly fee. I think it's that we bill clients out of cash flow instead of out of assets. And that is such a fundamental difference because of the types of clients that you're able to work with and the types of clients that are able to really access what we're doing. But it's so much about building, in many ways, a practice that is more geared towards helping clients with behavioral management, developing good habits, instead of being so focused on working with people that already have all of those habits because they're already wealthy when they get to us, which is historically how the RIA marketplace has focused.
And to me, it really is that phenomenon of that this is a model where you bill from cash flow, from income, and that opens up different markets. I'd watched a Twitter exchange recently with someone that was talking about the XYPN model, and these people kept asking, other advisors kept asking questions like, well, the model seems really dumb. Like if you had a client that had $1 million in a portfolio, but they didn't have very much income, then you wouldn't be able to work with them. To which I replied, well, if you had a client that made $1 million a year and didn't have a portfolio, you wouldn't be able to work with them. Which one do you think is actually a better client in the long run? The person who accumulated $1 million once, or the person who makes $1 million a year but doesn't have a portfolio yet? It's so different that I find so many advisors just continue to anchor back in things like, yeah, but what about the portfolio and what about the assets and the rest, and still seem to be having trouble transitioning this idea of no, when you work with people based on their income and maybe to some ancillary extent their assets and their overall net worth, you just open up whole different markets of clients that traditionally have been ignored by financial advisors. And so that's cool not only to just bring financial advice to more people, which is very much our mission for XY Planning Network, but it just becomes a phenomenal business opportunity for advisors that you get to go work with people where there's no competition because no one else is working with them because everybody's going after the same small subset of clients that have large liquid portfolios.
And I've started thinking about it in a little bit different way. And the best metaphor I can come up with is, imagine if we compare ourselves to, let's say, personal training. Historically, financial advisors have been the equivalent of folks that work with marathon athletes to try and win the Boston Marathon. So when someone came to us as a personal trainer, they were already running marathons. We just are trying to help them take it to the next level. So what does that mean? That means they already exercise every day. They already eat right. They take care of their body. They get enough sleep. They've already worked in all of the miles that they run into their daily and weekly lives. So they already have the foundation, and now we're trying to help them take it to the next level. And what we're doing, I think, is the equivalent of that. It is sort of where we came from. But now we're sort of looking at this model. How do we build a couch to 5K program? How do we help clients that are really motivated? And maybe Couch to 5K is too far back, and maybe it's the 5K to 10K program. I think we're doing both. But we're not working with people that are already marathon athletes. We're working with people that need help establishing those habits to become successful long-term financially, to become financially healthy. And it really is about how do we help you develop a good eating plan and a good exercise plan and develop all of these foundational habits that you don't have yet because you're just either not old enough or just haven't built wealth. And so you just haven't learned these pieces that are, necessary for long-term financial success. And I think that's the part that is still blowing the minds of advisors, is this concept of working with people on a Couch to 5K program instead of a marathon training plan. And the truth is, we're going to turn a lot of people into marathon runners. We're also going to turn a lot of people into half marathon runners and 10K runners and people that, never want to become a marathon runner necessarily, but they still want to better themselves. And I think the shift from just focusing on sort of taking people to the next level and tweaking the plan as opposed to really building foundational habits is actually remarkably different and more different than we give it credit for. And I see that in firms that are sort of shocked when they start working with younger clients and just the difference in the planning process. And I don't think we've done the best job of articulating that up until this point.
Yeah, it's so different. I mean, it even just gets back to the old, like, if they don't have a lot of assets yet, then what do you give them advice on? What do you do for them?
Right. And just the way, and like telling a trainer, like, but they don't already run marathons. What do you do for them? And this is where the disconnect is as a marathon trainer, you're like, that's your focus. But for us, we're like, holy crap, we do a lot. To me, I'm like, what do you do for someone that already runs marathons? I'm like, what value are you providing? And of course they provide value, but yeah, it's frustrating. And I think that is the big shift, as you're mentioning. The reason we wanted to start with a benchmarking survey and start to track this over time is we do see that this is the future of the profession. And to be able to start actually gathering data to sort of track that progression and track that path for the future of the industry is going to be a lot of fun and it will be interesting. But enough of us, bantering about randomness. We can actually dive into some of the survey items, and we will link to the survey in the show notes. So if you are a member of the XY Planning Network, you can have full access to the survey. If you were at our conference and you got a paper copy, if you're not a member, then it is available for purchase for $197, so $197. And as we go through this, we're going to hit some of the highlights and some of the pieces that maybe surprised us, more so validated. And I think validated some of the things that we've believed and that we've been teaching on, which I want to touch on here in a second. But I truly believe anyone that's looking at starting a practice or looking at rolling out this type of service model, any of these things that we talk about in this show and others throughout it will easily save you $197. It will probably save you 20 or 50 times that on some of these pieces that we're gonna touch on. But I do think it's important because people keep asking me, what about the benchmarking survey surprised you? And there aren't a lot of surprises in here, and I don't want that to be because we influenced the survey. So data always lies, right? And that's the beauty of data, is you can absolutely influence the data with the way that you ask questions, what questions you ask, how you ask them, what answers you give, the way you react to an answer. So this is why we hired an outside agency. We hired an expert to come in and do this with no instruction from us other than we said, these are sort of the things we want to look at. But we did not say, okay, let's be sure that we tilt this question and try to write this question in a way that gets this result so it validates what we're doing. So,
and it's an important note there. Like truly, that was why we had an outside firm. Well, there were really two reasons as to why we had an outside firm. You do the benchmarking study, including even do the analysis and the number crunching and the write-up. We gave them a little bit of feedback on the final benchmarking study report just to help them understand, like, okay, these are things that our members will actually be really interested in. So you want to go into a little more detail here. This data point just isn't going to be that relevant for people. You can probably dial the discussion back a little bit. But, they did the survey, they ran the survey, they put the survey out, they did the data analysis, they did all the number crunching, and they wrote the study. So it's their, third-party experts' view of what's going on here, not just us kind of taking the data and manipulating it to make whatever points we wanted to make. And the other reason why we had someone do it independently is we wanted to actually make sure that members were comfortable giving full transparency in what they put in. So, we got no individual member data. No one in XYPN, including even us at the top, had direct access to any of the data or the firm information. We only got the rolled up anonymized summary statistics and details, just to make sure that everybody was comfortable and willing to give sort of full and true and accurate data about what was going on.
Yeah, and I know that one of the other questions we've gotten a lot, or that I have heard from advisors quite a bit, is just around the quality of the data. I think we can freely admit that one of the things that we learned through this process and that we heard of a lot of the advisors respond with is, we were asking a lot of questions on data points they weren't tracking, and it took them a lot of time to either go gather the data or they weren't able to answer questions. So I think one of the benefits of doing a survey like this year over year is our advisors will start to track their data better and do a better job just with the various metrics that we were asking about. But no advisory firm, there's no survey out there that asks as many questions as ours asks, that finds 500 advisory firms that give them perfect answers that are always correct. There's always going to be anomalies in the data. And
I'll admit that's actually probably the area you were kind of raising the question earlier about what surprised you the most out of the study. I'll admit, for me, I think the thing that surprised me the most was some of the gaps that we actually ended out with in the data. I was really excited to look at in some detail, like for the typical advisory firm, what percentage of their revenue is specifically from monthly retainers and what percentage of their revenue is from their hourly work, and what portion of their revenue is like one-time plans versus the ongoing plans, and how much of their revenue is made up by assets under management if they're doing it. And what we found was a lot of advisors in their early years are not keeping detailed tracking about where their money is coming from. They knew exactly what their total revenue was. They could answer that really easily. Like, A, you kind of have to do it for your tax return anyways. And B, it's really easy to just look at the dollar amounts in the bank account and make sure they're going up and count how much they've gone up through the year. But not a lot of members were actually keeping detailed tracking of the different ways that they were getting paid. As many people know, I'm a little bit of a nerd around data, so I kind of do that. Yeah, it turns out. That's something for me I've always done in my business and all my businesses, that if you want to run a good business, you have to keep track of the data about how you're actually getting paid and where your money's coming from, so you can figure out what's working and what's not. And we kind of discovered through this process in the first year that a lot of members are not. And so, as Alan, as you'd said, like, I hope that now that we've gone through this for the first year, it's maybe a good reminder to members, to everyone, that, you really need to keep track of the data of your business in the first place. And one of the most important things to do is keep track of the mixture of your revenue. We were able to find out what are people offering and how does their offering change over time. But, the breakouts of revenue, while some people were able to report their own data, we didn't have enough good, clean data to actually be able to do detailed reporting about revenue mixtures this year. Certainly hoping we'll have much better data next year. But there was a little bit of a surprise to me that people weren't keeping closer track of where their money's coming from. Because if you're running your firm, you really need to do that.
Yeah, so we pulled out 7, highlights that we'll talk about. We talked about 4 or 5 of these actually in our opening keynote session at the conference. So we pulled out a couple of extra ones that we wanted to go through. And again, you can pull the full report, which, scanning down through here, has 27 figures. So it has quite a bit more, and some things that honestly just weren't all that telling, weren't all that relevant, and some stuff that was interesting with additional narrative. But we wanted to focus on a few things. And so kicking it off, the first one will come as no surprise to folks. And this is where I say I want to be very clear that we did not influence the data. And it is that niches really do produce higher revenue per client in the long run and have more success with online and digital marketing. And the other piece to this too is that in the first year or two, niche firms do not have lower revenue than non-niche firms. Now, I will say this piece actually surprised me. Having a niche focus producing higher revenue per client long term, I think makes sense. You're able, if you have a very clear focus, you're able to provide more value per client because you are an expert in their situation, and therefore you should be charging more money per client. What I would have expected to see is that in the first 1 to 3 years, that it just takes longer for a niche focused firm to get started. And so the revenue would be lower early on than sort of a generalist. And then over time, it would cross. And this is the concern that people have, right? If I have a niche, I'm going to have to give up all this revenue and a client's going to come in and I can't work with them and I need the money. So I'm going to give up a lot of money to set myself up for long-term success. So it's sort of the short-term versus long-term battle. And what we found was that niche-focused firms actually had similar revenue in their first couple of years as non-niche focused firms, and that they actually weren't giving up revenue in their first couple of years overall, but were setting themselves up for long-term success. That really surprised me.
Yeah, we hear this all the time, right? But if I go for a niche, what about all the clients that I might meet that aren't in my niche that I'm going to turn away? And I wasn't quite as surprised by the data here, because the subtle piece of that's missing from that traditional view of like, what if I pick a niche when I start and then I have to turn away all these clients that don't meet the niche? When you get started, there aren't a lot of clients.
True.
You don't there's sort of this vision out there of like, if I go into a niche, then 20 people are going to call me and I'm going to have to turn away 18 of them because they don't fit the niche. And the unfortunate truth is 20 people don't call. You have to go out and find them. You have to start whatever your marketing process or approach is going to be to go find clients. And so the reality is until you have established and developed a niche, well, so either way, as you're getting started with your practice, you have to go find clients. And so if you don't have a niche, you go find some people. If you do have a niche, you go find some people. And it's pretty much the same. You find similar people at similar levels because you're not an established firm and you don't have a lot of credibility yet. And even if you're pursuing a niche, you're not established in it yet, so you don't get much amplification effect. So this didn't surprise me quite as much because all you're actually seeing here is the reality of, look, if you go out there and work your butt off and hustle, you can get 10 or 20 clients in your first year. Those are kinds of the numbers that we saw. So if you work your butt off and hustle, you can get 10 or 20 clients in the first year. Whether you have a niche or not, no one knows who the heck you are in the first year. So your hustle is going to produce about the same results no matter what. And that's pretty much what we saw in the data. But the difference is that when you're focusing yourself into a niche, a couple of years later, this starts getting easier because your business starts to get more focused. You actually do start getting known in your niche. You start commanding a little bit more expertise. You get more focus, and suddenly the numbers start lifting up. And that was really the distinction that we saw. So for advisors in their first 3 years, the average revenue per client from someone with a niche was about $1,400, and the average revenue per client for someone without a niche was about $1,400. That was kind of the average billing of a client, which no great surprise, that's right around $120 a month was kind of average fee of what people are ending out with. But when we looked at the subset of members that were 10 plus years of experience, which granted means they weren't doing their whole careers in XYPN, obviously, because they've only been XYPN members for 3.5 years, but they built into a niche. And so we can still look and see what's going on with their practices. The average advisor with 10 plus years of experience in no niche had taken their average revenue per client from $1,400 to $1,600. The average advisor with a niche had taken their average revenue per client from $1,400 to $3,000. That's an 80% higher revenue per client when you've got a niche versus not.
That's huge.
It's monstrous because, again, like bear in mind, most of us, you can only handle about 100 clients before just like your brain and your capacity starts tapping out. In fact, a lot of advisors I know don't even like to go that high. They might start tapping out somewhere around 50 to 75 clients. So if you're only going to end out being able to handle about 75 clients, that's what you can do before your brain's just getting tired of all the people that you're dealing with. Then we can kind of do the math here. The revenue you earn per client times your maximum capacity of clients, that's your maximum income. That's where you tap out. So the advisors that have not gone into niches and they're averaging about $1,600 a client, if you're going to tap out at 75 clients, your maximum revenue is about $120,000 of annual income. Gross. Then some expenses come out of that. Now, you might not have a ton of expenses out of that if once you go into maintenance mode with your clients. So maybe you can keep 100 of that and it's not a bad income. But if you've got the niche and you're doing $3,000 of revenue per client, then when you've got the same 75 clients and you're at capacity, your revenue isn't $120,000 a year, it's $220,000 a year. And now you're taking home an extra $100,000 a year of income, working with the same number of clients, doing the same amount of work or possibly even less work. Because the truth is, once you're in a niche, it actually gets really efficient to service them because they all need the same thing. Because you focus on a niche and your process becomes very, very standardized. So you get similar numbers early on because everybody's just got to hustle for clients in the early years, and you get the clients from the hustle, not whether you have a niche or not have a niche, frankly. But in the later years, the ones who focus into a niche end out walking away with $100,000 a year of extra income, working with the same number of clients and doing less work. That's why it matters so much.
And said another way, you could make the same amount of money, but work 3 days a week instead of 5.
Yes.
if that's what you choose to do. And again, like I was just surprised in the first couple of years that people really aren't giving up any revenue. But, I remember when we had Daniel Wren speaking at the conference in 2016, he ran the numbers and he said, I'm providing, let's see, I'm making more money per niche client. I provide more value to those clients and I'm spending less time with those clients. And that was really when he looked at that data, when he made the shift into really focusing on his niche. Now it's tough to gather that data. And that's why we encourage it and being very cognizant of it, because it is so important. You can make such, dramatic decisions based on it that'll have great long-term effects for you. But it really does matter. The other thing that we found was that advisors with a niche were finding more success marketing online than advisors who do not have a niche. And I think this is pretty obvious because, people say like, oh, well, I'm going to start a blog or a podcast and, I work with young professionals. So I'm going to talk about Roth IRAs. And like the last thing the internet needs is another article on Roth IRAs. What the internet needs is how a female tech executive can handle her compensation negotiation for more stock options. Like that is a great discussion that Meg can write and someone can be searching for some of those keywords, find her content. And because it's so highly targeted, it's so much easier to provide more value with online content if you have a focus.
And the thing that struck me about this, there were actually two categories where advisors with a niche focus did materially better in their marketing. The first was online Google searches. And the second was the XYPN Find an Advisor profile pages. Mm-hmm. And we've noticed this in talking to a lot of the advisors that are succeeding with their XYPN profile pages. The ones who have niches and a focus tend to get a lot more business because, again, no one wakes up at 2:00 in the morning in a cold sweat going like, I got to get me a comprehensive financial plan. That's not what people search for. They search because they've got some anxious problem. I'm freaking out about my student loans. So what do? Either first thing in the morning or even at 2:00 in the morning, I pull up my phone and I start looking for advisors who can help me with a student loan. And if they come to the XYPN page, they search for advisors who can help me with the student loan. We, on the XYPN profile pages, we actually give people 3 ways to search. You can search by niche and specialty. You can search by compensation model, because obviously everyone for XYPN does monthly retainers as an option, but many also do hourly. Some also do AUM. So depending on what the person's looking for, they can screen by compensation type, or we let them do the good old fashioned location search, right? Like search in my state. And we keep the data on this because God bless Google Analytics. We can actually track which search mechanisms people use. And it turns out that once you give people the choice, the majority of all XYPN traffic searches for an advisor based on niche. And less than a quarter of them search based on location, zip code, state, things like that. Most people don't want an advisor in their area. They want an advisor that solves their problems. And so the more specific you are to solving a problem, the more likely you are to actually get a result. And the advisors that have great generalist profiles and could probably work with every single person who shows up on the XYPN website get no actual leads.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So the second takeaway, or sort of the second piece of data that was really interesting, was the heightened success that the CFP designation provides. Now, this is a tough one because is it causation or correlation? For anybody who took Statistics 101 knows this is always the battle is if, what we found was that people that hold the CFP designation have higher income, they have more clients, and they have faster growth inside of their firm than advisors that do not have the CFP. Now, do we believe that is simply because they have the letters CFP after their name? Michael, you tell me what you think, but I would say the answer is no. It's not just because they have the CFP.
Yeah, it's certainly not just because they have the CFP. I perhaps that makes a decisive impact in one or two client situations, but not most. I think it actually derives more kind of indirectly, as we'll talk about in some of the other data results that were here as well. One of the biggest blocking points that you have when you're getting started in your business as an advisor is just actually having enough confidence in your own value to want to go out there and try to help people and ask them to pay you for advice. And the advisors that have their CFP certification, I find just they're more confident in their value because they're trained and they know their stuff, and they know they're trained and know their stuff because they took a very, very hard test to validate that they've trained and know their stuff. And a lot of the advisors I see that don't have their CFP marks, their impacts their own confidence, and or not that the lack of the CFP impacts their own confidence, but they don't have the education and the training that would otherwise bolster their confidence. And I think a lot of it comes from either A, just the difference in confidence levels of having your CFP versus not, and in some cases just actual flat out value that you provide. I mean, just we are in a knowledge business selling our expertise. So when you know more stuff, you have more things to sell that are valuable. It's kind of like stocking your shelves. You know, if you have a better inventory in your store, it's more likely the person who comes in will buy something. And when you got more of a knowledge inventory because you've done your CFP certification, you're more likely to actually be able to do business with someone and give them a knowledge value transfer.
Yeah, I also think that this plays in, and I don't think we have the data on this, but I think part of the results we're seeing from having the CFP is also just a level of experience doing financial planning. We didn't exactly ask that question. I mean, we could see years of industry experience, but industry experience is very broad. I'm not sure that, someone who spent 20 years in banking necessarily has a leg up, on someone that with just like 3 years of real financial planning experience. But I do think there's some level of correlation here and not necessarily causation in the sense that the CFP is also indicative of other things going on. And again, we need to parse out the data and ask additional questions next year to get at this. But, people very frequently ask us, how many firms leave the XY Planning Network? We talk a lot about our growth, but what firms leave? And the overwhelming majority of the firms that leave XYPN do not have the CFP. And they either did not launch or launched unsuccessfully in the long run.
Yep. It's a small minority of the membership. Less than a third of the XYPN members do not have their CFPs. So, said the other way around, about 70% have their CFPs, but the 30% who don't and are mostly working towards it, the overwhelming majority of the people who don't succeed are in the 30% of non-CFPs, which ironically actually means our data is skewed because, all the income averages and client averages that we have here for non-CFPs, those are the people who are actually still in the network and still trying, right? It doesn't include all the zeros.
What do they call that with mutual funds when it
bias?
Survivorship bias. Thank you. So that's really what we're seeing here. That's a great point.
Even with the survivorship bias, right? Even with the fact that the non-CFP category doesn't include all the people who didn't succeed and failed out and would have dragged the numbers down. Even with the survivorship bias, what we see in the results is the advisors with CFPs are earning 30 to 40% more than the advisors without CFPs. 30 to 40% more. I mean, it's a dramatic difference, and end out with anywhere from about 20 to 30% more clients. So they're not only the ones with CFPs are getting more clients, they're commanding more revenue per client. They're driving dramatically higher total revenue. And that's beating out the survivor non-CFPs. If we had the failed non-CFPs in there as well, the gap would be even more dramatic.
Yeah, it's a great point and something that we continue to harp on. And again, these were definitely two things that we push very hard. So it was a little bit relieving. The data actually
did actually support that CFPs do better and niches do better. Thank goodness.
Yeah, it would have been really sad to have to be like, all right, getting your CFP harms you financially.
Otherwise, we would have to go back and delete like 100 episodes of niches. It would have been horrible.
Every time we've said niche, just delete it. It'll be fine. So that was our second piece. The next one is that the change in fee structures over time. as advisors become, just more experienced or working with more clients. And again, I don't think this was surprising, but it was interesting to note that over time, advisors tend to add AUM or assets under management, add investment management as a service, and they tend to drop hourly services as they grow. And, again, neither of these are really surprising, but it was cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just marks the evolution of what you tend to do as a firm when you're getting started. So, as we mentioned earlier, we didn't get detailed mixtures of revenue because not enough members kind of had the good breakout details for us to do the data. But we could look at just who was offering retainer fees, AUM, upfront fees, and hourly fees, and look at that trend data. And we looked at it by what members do over time. So what do they do in their first year? What do they do in their second year? And what do they do in their third year? And the trend was pretty striking that, by a couple years out, everybody's doing monthly retainers. No great surprise because that's what we do here at XYPN. But the number that do hourly falls off and the number that do AUM lifts dramatically. And I mean, it sort of makes sense to me because frankly, I've seen this evolution happen in other fee-for-service advisor models, including many folks that I know that were at Garrett Planning Network over the years. Most advisors start out at least offering hourly, even if that's not their primary business focus. Because as we said earlier, just when you're getting started, you need revenue. You need to get revenue going as quickly as possible. And so if someone will pay you, even if it's just for an hour of your time, that's an hour of your time that you were not otherwise getting paid for. So sounds great. Let's do it. But the effect that happens as the business starts growing and you actually start getting clients that pay recurring revenue and are on your subscription fees and you're getting more of them, all of a sudden spending your time to focus on a client that's only going to pay you for an hour or two of your time seems less appealing. And one of the things that was striking to me about this data point was the number of advisors doing an upfront plan where you get paid for an upfront plan and then doing retainers. That didn't change much. It was about 70% of our members across the board charge an upfront before they do their ongoing. Just the hourly portion that begins to decline as the business grows.
Yeah, and again, no small surprise. The quick rise in AUM is interesting, and I think a lot of this has to do with the types of clients that advisors are working with early on, that they may legitimately not need investment management services. Or as an advisory firm's getting started, they don't want to focus on doing due diligence on model portfolios and building out their models. And so they're just not offering it. But over time, they've begun to work with more and more and more clients. And this is a service that they're going to offer or they're going to send them to go directly to Vanguard or whatnot and outsource it. So like, all right, well, I might as well bring this in-house. And, I think that that's indicative of just the types of clients that they're working with and the services that they're rolling out in order to serve, the clients that they're working with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamic that quickly emerges, and again, I've seen this for a lot of advisors in fee-for-service models that say, like, I just want to get paid for the advice. And nothing wrong with it. I'm certainly not negative on it at all. We champion it. But then you work with clients for a while, and at some point, some of them start saying, like, can't you just do this for me? And, like, I'll pay you for it. Can't you just do this for me? And the advisors that don't do AUM start adding an AUM. Honestly, like, if there was a deeper market for like fee for service and fee only insurance, I suspect more advisors would start adding in the insurance services as well. Unfortunately, we live in a world where almost all of it is still commission based, so there's no way to layer it in an advice only, fee only model. But it just comes back to that point that the clients want some help with it. So that's part of why we tried to build our support services accordingly around XY Planning Network. So you can't get paid for like fee only insurance. It just doesn't exist out there. So we have a partnership with Low Load Insurance. And the members that increasingly were saying, my clients want me to help them with their portfolios, but I don't want to be an investment manager. I'm here to be a financial planner. But that's why we launched XY Investment Solutions, so that we could help people with that end as well. And, just let advisors spend their time doing their advising and what they do best. But clients do need help with the implementation and the follow through. And so we're trying to make sure that the right partners are at the table to make sure that all advisors can help their clients with the implementation. I think there's this great myth out there that advisors that charge fee for service can't and don't help their clients implement. And they certainly can, and they certainly do. You just need to work with the right partners to be able to do it, because you're getting paid for the advice, and that's the model.
Absolutely. So the next interesting data point, and this is the question that everyone asks us: how much money am I going to make? Right? Like how much in year 1, year 2, and year 3? And so it was really cool to be able to actually pull this out and see that by the 3rd year, median revenue for our advisors is around $80,000 a year. Now that's gross revenue. So gross revenue of $80,000 a year, and they are serving approximately 50 clients, which actually goes back to the math that we did earlier. It's around $1,600 per client in terms of revenue. And so I'm trying to remember, was this at the beginning of the 3rd year or the end of the 3rd year? How was this data?
So this was actually, there is actually a lag effect to this. So this was XYPN folks in their 2nd to 3rd year. So they have closed 2 full calendar years, and they're effectively in, or at least partway through, their 3rd year. So, I guess like if you want to take the midpoint average, on average, this is actually really where people are at 2.5 years in. For some of them, they were in this category, they were at the beginning of their 3rd year. And so most of this data was actually year 2 data, not year 3. And then some of them were at the end of their 3rd year. And so this was pretty much all 3rd year data. So kind of call it 2.5 years on average, to be fair.
So 2.5 years in. So let's call that, 30-ish months, just to make it easy. But yeah, so they're earning around $80,000, which it may actually have been a little bit lower than I would have expected. But just overall, when you say $80,000, but, if you do the math, working with 50 clients within 2.5 years, most advisory firms out there are happy to grow by 1 new client a month. And these advisors are bringing on 50 in 30 months. So they're bringing on, close to 2 a month.
Well, and bear in mind that, where those firms actually sit as they're looking forward at the end of this survey would be a much higher revenue level. Because this is actual dollars that they collected in revenue over the trailing 12 months. So, the average firm was adding about 15 clients a year, right? Just to get you to about 16 clients a year, to get you to almost 50 after 3 years. So if you're adding 16 clients a year, that means the trailing revenue from the past year, most of those clients hadn't even paid a year's worth of revenue yet.
Right.
Like the client who joined 1 month before this survey happened and is paying you a great $200 a month counts as a client, but and is part of your forward-looking revenue, but only paid you $200 in the past 12 months, even though they're going to pay you $2,400 in the next 12. And so we didn't specifically ask the forward projecting number to get the data on it, but I suspect what you'd find is for most of these advisors, their forward-looking annual revenue from this point was probably somewhere between $100,000 and $110,000. Just as we look at the trajectory, like if you're adding $25,000 to $30,000 a year of revenue every year, then when you get to this point, 2.5 years in, and you look forward based on the clients you've already got that are just going to pay you over the next year as long as you're servicing them, you're probably looking at $100,000 to $110,000 of forward-looking revenue. And my guess is that's what we'll see when we then do next year's survey, which will look back over the year that we can now look forward on, and that we're going to see advisors by the time they've closed the books on their 3rd full year. They close the books on their 3rd full year at about $100,000 of revenue. That seems to be what we're cruising towards.
And this does validate sort of a guess that we have had, which is somewhere between in your 2nd to 3rd year. So we'll say between 24 and 36 months is about when you start replacing sort of pre-quit my job income. Now, depending on where you live, right? If you're in DC or San Francisco, it may take you a little bit longer than this, but I was making $60,000, $65,000 before I got fired. And this was about my path as well to being able to replace that income. Took me to around 2 years. And so, for advisors that are trying to figure out, okay, well, when can I really start drawing a salary? Now, $80,000 doesn't mean you're actually netting $80,000. Still have some expenses and things like that. But if you're making 80, you're probably netting 60 to 65. And so, when you're planning your budget, you need to plan for 2 to 3 years before you're earning a reasonable salary. Now, maybe you're making $20,000 in months 12 through 24, who knows? But that's the runway that you need.
Yep.
You need enough runway to make it 2 to 3 years. Now, you don't literally have to have enough to pay 100% of your living expenses for 3 years before it makes sense. But you either need income to match or some level of, savings in order to cover for that income. But, within 2 to 3 years, you should be earning a healthy income. And while some advisors out there may want to make $1 million a year, there are a lot of advisors, I think, that are thrilled to make $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 and have upward trajectory of their income going forward.
And I mean, that's the thing to bear in mind as well, is the upward trajectory, right? Like another way to look at the data here is say, if you're going to cap out somewhere around 75 to 100 clients, like the typical advisor's on their way to $160,000 of revenue by 5 to 6 years.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a number.
It really is.
That's a hell of a number. I mean, again, it's a grind early on. That's part of the deal. But, to be on a path to grossing 160 and you're probably netting 130 to 140 of that, even with a little bit of additional assistance at that point. And of course, what happens for most advisors is as you get more experience, especially if you're digging into your niche, as we talked about, your average revenue per client is lifting up as well as you tend to start moving up market with experience and deepening into the niche, which means I suspect we'll see advisors that are already pushing $175,000 to $200,000 of revenue by 5 or 6 years. And I know we have a handful in XYPN now that are 3 to 4 years in, and they're already north of 150,000.
Yep. Yeah, and all these numbers are median, right? Like we're not trying to give just the top 5%. And so some folks will fall below this. Half of folks technically fall below this, but this is a pretty good gauge. Switching gears a little bit, the next data point that we pulled out was looking at meeting frequency. A very common question is, well, if I'm billing my client monthly, does that mean I need to, meet with them monthly? Or how often do I need to meet with my younger clients? And this was interesting. So the data showed that meeting quarterly does not actually have any higher client retention rates than if you meet semi-annually or annually. So meeting with a client either monthly or quarterly, so 12 or 4 times a year, does not have higher retention rates than meeting 1 or 2 times a year, which was interesting. That I would say that surprises me.
In person. Now, bear in mind, like in-person meetings, this isn't meant to imply like you can just you can just meet with your clients once a year and then like never interact with them for the other 11 and a half months of the year until you're scheduling the next annual meeting. But just in-person meetings, no measurable effect on frequency. The retention rates were substantively similar straight across between quarterly, semi-annually, and annually. In fact, technically, the quarterly meetings were actually the lowest retention rate of the category. Not much lower than the others, but was actually the lowest retention rate of the category. And I think it just helps to emphasize that, like, yes, you do need to provide ongoing value and you do need to connect with clients and you do need to deliver stuff to them. But this whole idea that the thing clients want to pay for is sitting down across from you for an hour or two and looking at reports together and breaking bread and shaking hands at the end and all of that doesn't actually matter. The value matters. I mean, if you're not providing the value, you're going to get fired no matter what. But this idea that more in-person FaceTime somehow boosts the success of the firm and the client retention, absolutely no indication whatsoever that's the case.
You bring up an interesting sort of point that goes along with this, and that is, in our industry, we are amazingly fortunate that we have, 97% retention rates across the industry, which is insane. I mean, no other industry has that level of retention. It's just incredible.
Especially for the amount of revenue that we generate per person, right? I mean, there's
Right.
There's a bunch of businesses out there like, we only charge $10 a month and we can't get people to stick around at a 97% rate.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it shows how valuable we are as an industry. But people do ask a lot around retention rates. And am I just going to lose all of my young clients year over year over year? And what we saw was the lowest, and we broke this out by how frequently they're meeting, but the lowest retention rates were 93% and the highest being 98%. So that's incredible. That's a really telling story that clients are sticking with their advisors, even if they're younger, even if they don't have assets to manage, even if they're doing a lot of virtual meetings, even if they're doing habit formation instead of asset location strategies or asset protection strategies, they're sticking with their advisors.
And what struck me as well about this dynamic is, I've looked at the benchmarking studies for assets under management firms for a long time as well. Pretty much the same retention rates. Leading AUM firms, the average retention rate for years and years and years has been 97%.
Mm-hmm.
And the advisors doing the monthly retainers, their retention rates were basically fluctuating between 93 and 98. So, a couple points lower than the AUM model, but not drastically different. It's not as though like, oh my God, if I don't sit down with my clients and meet with them every month, then I'm going to lose a quarter of them or half of them at the end of the year. That's not what we're seeing at all. Most are sticking around. Obviously, that still means a lot of advisors is working very, very hard to demonstrate their value, but the retention rates aren't dramatically worse than what we see in the AUM model, and it's really not the face time, at least not the in-person face time, that drives the retention rate.
Yeah, anecdotally, I know of some advisors that struggled with client turnover at the 12-month mark, and typically what they found was it was the way they were positioning their service. That it was actually a part of the sales process was that they were pitching this as, hey, come in for a year and let's get, your financial house in order. And that's what clients were buying. And the expectation from the client's perspective was they would leave after a year. And once you make a tweak to that process and say, hey, look, we're going to do a lot of work in the first year, but the ongoing value proposition is still there. It's just going to be evolving from implementation to more, overall monitoring and maintenance. Changes that dynamic.
And you make such an important point there of how the positioning matters. I do know a handful of our members that have been struggling with retention. Their retention numbers are not this high. But, when I ask them, I routinely find some version of what you just said, that, the way that they've been working with clients, they're saying like, look, come work with me and try this out for 6 months and, we'll do some stuff together and I think I can help move you forward. And then they were finding that their clients were leaving after 6 months, having successfully done some stuff. I'm like, well, so you did it to yourself. Like you created value, you delivered value, but you created an expectation in your client's mind that you're done in 6 months after you deliver the value. So they checked out because you told them they were supposed to check out. You didn't really want them to. You wanted them to get the value over the 6 months and then stick around thereafter. But if you communicate, this is a short-term engagement and then you'll be on your way, people listen and they do it.
It's so true. I mean, they know what they're buying because it's what you're selling. And I don't think, I know of some advisory firms that are getting into the space that say, oh, well, let's just not give clients all of the recommendations in the first year because we want them to stick around. Like, don't give them the whole plan. Let's hold a bunch of it back and just trickle out the data points over time. And it's just not necessary, right? You don't need to handcuff your clients by withholding information from them to get them to stay. You just have to keep providing and demonstrating value and they will stay. 93% retention rates at the low end of this. I don't think we have an aggregate retention rate across the data set that I've seen, but even at 93%, and it's probably closer to 95 when you actually aggregate it, is incredible. Like I just can't explain how high that is for any other industry. So you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, it's such a striking effect. I think just, we've said it before, but a lot of members have to go through it for a while to really experience it. But when you're working with people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, their lives change a lot. Stuff happens and they need more advice and they need more help. And so you don't even have to trickle out the plan and withhold value from them just to stretch it out on them to get them to stick around long enough to want to renew and keep working with you. Deliver as much value as you possibly can and then remind them of the value that you've created and say, something new is going to happen in your life in the next couple of months. And I'm here and ready and waiting to work with you when it happens. And that's part of the value.
So 2 more data points that we'll get to. One is only about a third of advisor interactions with their clients are done in person. And about 2/3 are done video, telephone, and email. the higher the frequency of interaction with clients, the more likely that it's digital. Which, I don't think this is mind-blowing. I don't think we weren't looking this day like, oh, I can't believe the more often I'm speaking with a client, the more likely it is that was a digital interaction instead of an in-person meeting. But it continues to reinforce the fact that clients are not coming to us looking for like an in-person monthly meeting. I mean, they're looking for meetings, right? They want to meet with their advisor throughout the year, but they also want to be able to email question. I know you talk about this in one of your presentations that particularly younger generations are looking for, they want to be able to text, essentially. I mean, we're used to tweeting and texting, right? We want quick, small interactions and a lot of them. I'd rather send 100 texts to my advisor than actually have to sit down for an hour-long meeting with them. And so that's sort of, I think, coming through this data that we're starting to see the expectations of clients and the way that they want to interact with their advisor is evolving, and that we're truly done with the quarterly meeting where all of the work gets done in that meeting and we don't hear from our client until the next quarterly meeting. And if anything, that the number of actual planned meetings can start to decrease throughout the year, and the number of interactions throughout the year can increase. That will just be in a different format than the quarterly meeting.
Yeah, and I was struck as well that, as we looked at the data, in-person meeting was the plurality, with a third in person, because the other three categories were all somewhat smaller. But only about a third of all the interactions for the year were in-person meetings, and the other 2/3 were this combination of email, telephone, and video, for which actually email was the overwhelming number 2. And the more frequent the advisors interact with the clients, the more likely it was that they were doing email. And the one thing actually that did strike me about this was that the popularity of video conferencing was about the same as the popularity of a good old phone call. And in fact, for advisors who were connecting with their clients monthly, it was more likely they were doing it with a combination of email and telephone calls. Very little video. Most video activity didn't start showing up until advisors were meeting quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. And actually, a lot of advisors that we were seeing were basically doing like 1 or 2 in-person meetings a year and then 1 or 2 video conferences a year.
Which makes sense, because if you're looking for a quick interaction, you don't do video, right? We just don't have as a society, we're not using video in that way. We don't just like video call people unless we know them very well, right? And so you generally do just pick up the phone or you shoot people an email, and it's just a more convenient way. But it is interesting that overall the percentage of client interactions between phone and video were actually pretty even. But to your point, the more frequent the interaction, the more likely it was going to be email and then telephone. The less frequent interactions tended to be in-person meetings and then video conference. So then the final data point, and this may be the biggest takeaway out of this data set. And this is just something that I don't think surprises, but I think it's just such a huge takeaway for advisors. And, this is what you paid $197 for, or just listen to this podcast. And that is 100%. And almost never do you get to say 100% anytime you're doing data. 100% of our members raised their fees in the first 3 years of business. Now, you can look at this one of two ways. You can look at this and go, oh, well, as an advisor over my first 3 years, my value proposition increased and therefore I raised my fees, which may be true for some. Or you can look at this a second way, which I think we both agree here. And that is that advisors are just all the time, 100% of our advisors are underpricing their services when they first launch their business. They're undervaluing what they bring to the table, and they are underpricing. And this doesn't just have an effect of, oh, I need to raise my fees in the first 3 years. This has a dramatic long-term effect on your business if you underprice your services for your first 20, 30, 40 clients. Because we were looking at in the first 3 years, you raise your fees. Well, if in the first 3 years you got 50 clients, which is the median, and you're only charging $1,600 a year per client instead of the $2,500 a year per client that you should be charging, that's a dramatic amount of, that's actually a large amount of money that you're giving up. And it's a very tough to raise fees on clients that much. And so this does have long-term effects that if you're underpricing your services at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, to me, we mentioned at the beginning, but it's kind of good to come full circuit here. I think this is mostly a confidence issue. I mean, that's what jumps out at me. In fact, the data showed even just once people get into their second year, they're past their first full year, 61% of members are raising their fees after their first year. And, particularly, I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, once people are getting the third year, maybe they got better and more valuable and they were raising their fees. But we see it even a year in. And again, these are typical folks that are joining XYPN. I mean, they've already got 5 to 10 years of experience in their CFP marks. That's the most common profile that joins. Obviously, some people are outside of that. But when you're already 5 to 10 years of experience in your CFP marks, the fact that you're raising your fees after a year is not that you got more valuable after a year of experience. It's that you got more confident in your value after a year of doing it successfully. And I'll admit, I don't know. I wish I could figure out the magic way to help everyone who's getting started appreciate and understand the value that they're bringing to the table for their clients, and that you don't have to be so scared and underprice your services so much. And I see so many new advisors or new members, experienced advisors who are new members, do this. I think part of it is just this is why it's so important to have a plan in place about how your business is going to succeed, how you're going to pay your bills while you're getting started, what you're going to do to fill that income gap until you get to year 3, where you can get back to hopefully something close to 6 figures of revenue. When you put yourself in a position where you're desperate for the revenue and you're feeling desperate to get clients, you start compromising your value. And I think that's a lot of what we see. And once members get to the point where they're, getting into the third year and they're looking forward and saying, wow, I've got almost $100,000 of annualized revenue now from my clients that are on the books, as long as I can hold on to them. And you don't feel that desperation as much anymore. And you can look back and say, I've got clients, so I know this is working. Now I'm just growing it from here. That they find that confidence in their value, and 100% of them raise their fees. Just, it was so striking to me. You said it, Alan, there's nothing else in this study that we got to 100% on as some statistical data point. To have 100% raise their fees after 3 years or even in their third year, just, I think, speaks volumes to the struggle that we all go through in trying to get confident in the value that we bring. And the retention rates show we do bring the value. We're just not confident in ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, keep in mind with that 95% retention rate that we're talking about, is your first 20, 30, 50 clients are going to stay with you. And if you have them severely underpriced, when you go to raise their fees, they will leave because you've anchored them on that lower fee. So if you started your first 20 clients out at $50 a month and now you're at $200 a month, you will not get your $50 a month clients to $200 a month easily. And just think about the amount of revenue that you're losing. And there is no magic number. There is no, this is the perfect fee structure to start with and never go below this. I would say that the easiest number to start with is I would never charge less than $100 a month. I mean, there may be a few instances if you're working in employer plans or something where your niche just cannot afford
really
it.
Low cost of living area.
Yeah, I mean, that maybe. And I would set $100 a month at your base minimum fee. But even then, if you work with 100 clients and they're paying you $100 a month, I mean, that's $120,000 a year. Nothing to cough at, but 100 clients is a lot. If you're only working with 50 clients, that's $60,000. So, if you can get it up to that $150 to $200 a month level, I think that is much more ideal. I think it becomes much more of a sustainable business because you can look at it from both, one, how much money do you need to make and that you deserve to make more money. But 2, you need to make enough money to be in business long enough to continue to help your clients. No one is going to be serviced by you going bankrupt or by having to shut down your business because you only charge your clients $50 a month because you were trying to help them as much as you can, but you can't survive on that. So if you want to be here for the long run for those clients, because the real value of financial planning is in the long-term relationship, not in the initial planning phase, that you deserve to make enough money and your clients deserve for you to be in business to continue to work with them throughout the years. So charge appropriately.
And if you're feeling this pressure, if you need one tactic to deal with this, tell people when you're getting started with them, look, as we're getting started here, we're having an initial discount for our first few folks where they get the first year at a discounted rate. We normally are going to be charging $150 a month, but you can work with us in the first year at $100 a month. And when you do it that way, you're still setting the expectation for them that it's going to $150 a month at the end of the year. And you're already setting the anchor point to them that the price of this is not $100, which means at the end of the year, if you want to move it to $150, you have to explain a 50% increase. You're saying the anchor that this is a $150 a month service, but for the first few who sign up, however you want to frame it exactly, we're giving a limited time discount. And that's a way that you can still anchor people back to some number that's probably closer than what your true value should be. And I mean, maybe it's even a higher number. We have members in the network that are charging $200 a month, $300 a month, $400 a month for some people that are deep in niches. But whatever that anchor point is that you want to set them at, convey to them your value is the higher number. Do a discounted value if you need to. But the key points here, A, is you start with the higher number so they have a better grounding of what your value is. And please, please, only give them a temporary discount. The number of members I've seen that have said, like, if you start with me now, like, I'll give you this discount forever because, like, forever sounds awesome and it's an amazing deal. No one is actually making the decision about whether to work with you based on the discount you promised them in the decade of the 2020s and 2030s. You don't need to promise lifetime discounts to people to get them to start with you. They're just trying to figure out if they're going to stick with you for the next 3 to 6 months. Nobody cares what they're paying you in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Most of you people probably don't even care that much how they're going to pay you in 1 or 2 years because they're just trying to figure out if they're going to keep you to the 3 months or 6 months or a year. So if you feel the need to give someone a discount because you're trying to have them get started and you want to get some revenue in, just say, hey, our usual cost is $150 a month, but we're offering a discount down to $100 a month for our first 10 clients. Love to work with you here. The discount will apply for the first year, although I hope we're going to be working together for a long time to come and that you'll see my value as more than worthwhile once we get to the 1 year mark.
Yeah, so this was a lot of fun, honestly, to get the data and to go through the process of really defining what is it that we're looking for from our firms and what are the data points that we need to help our advisors be more successful. And that's really what this was about, was setting expectations, appropriate expectations for firms that are looking to get started, as well as, testing some of our hypotheses around, having a niche, having the CFP, how much money you can make, and why all of these various pieces are important. And I'm very much looking forward to having several years of data and getting some longitudinal data around how firms progress over time. You rarely talk to financial planning firms that are shrinking. So I suspect all of the data points will go up over time. How fast and how big those numbers go up will be interesting to see. But, I think this was really valuable, honestly, to have even in its first year, which, typically first year survey is truly a beta test. But I think we got a lot of really valuable data and valuable insights out of it this year.
Yeah, we did. I was really thrilled with what we had. Again, the only part that I was a little bit bummed about is that we didn't get better detail on the actual revenue risk mix, by year 3, what portion of people's revenue is typically the retainer fee portion versus the AUM portion versus the hourly or project fees they're still doing. I'm hoping to get more of that data next year as we go deeper on this. But, it's pretty cool to see the model taking shape, to see everyone's revenue ramping up. Again, just looking at the trajectories here, I mean, people that are getting to $80,000 after about 2.5 years. I mean, that means typical members adding about $25,000 a year of new revenue to their practice every year. And the cool thing when you own your business, like, you own all of that and you can keep building as long as you want. So it's not even just about the fact that people are getting to 80,000 after 3 years or into their third year. It's that they should be at 100,000 by the time they're into their fourth year. And a lot of these folks should be trending towards 150,000 by their 6th year. And then you really actually get to start making some cool decisions as a business owner about, are you done there? That's an amazing income for most people. Your expenses won't be that high. You can keep most of it. Or do you want to start building a bigger business and, hiring another advisor and trying to grow that to $300,000 of revenue where you only pay the other advisor a portion of the next 150 and you make some profit and you're earning income as a advisory business owner, not just getting paid to be an advisor.
Well, Michael, thanks again for taking the time on a weekend evening. Well, I guess almost weekend evening. Come on the show and talk through the benchmarking survey with me. I appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Any chance to talk nerdy data is good for me.
Always welcome.
Thank you.
Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes with myself and Kitces, and to finally find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.